My wife had been the chief of police for exactly 11 hours and 43 minutes when I found the boot on her Rolls-Royce. The ceremony was in 3 hours. Her dress uniform was hanging on the back of the bedroom door. Her badge, newly minted with the Cypress Ridge PD seal, was sitting in a velvet box on the dresser. And out front, in our own driveway clamped to the front left wheel of her 2023 Ghost, was a bright yellow immobilization device that a Sentinel Guard Services patrol officer had placed there sometime between 2 and 6 in the morning. I stood there in the Texas dark coffee going warm in my hand, looking at that yellow clamp, and I thought whoever put that there has no idea what they just did. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 54 years old, and for 28 years I worked as a mechanical engineer for Meridian Energy Solutions, one of the larger upstream oil and gas operations in the Houston Basin. I retired in 2022 with a pension, a bad right knee from too many years on concrete plant floors, and a deeply ingrained habit of treating every problem like a system failure waiting to be documented and analyzed. That last part turned out to matter more than I expected. Diana and I had been married 29 years by the time we moved to Cypress Ridge Estates. We'd met at Texas Southern University in 1993, her studying criminal justice, me studying mechanical engineering, both of us the first in our families to finish college. She joined Houston PD in 1995 as a patrol officer in the 3rd Ward, worked her way up through detective, sergeant, lieutenant, and finally commander over the next 26 years. She was methodical, patient, and possessed of a quality I've always privately called command gravity, the ability to walk into a room and immediately be the person everyone else orients toward without her saying a word or making a gesture. It was there when she was 22, and it only deepened over 3 decades. When the city of Cypress Ridge, a municipality of about 87,000 people in the northwest corridor of Harris County, posted the chief of police position in early 2022, Diana applied because I dared her to. That's the honest version of how it happened. She'd been passed over for a deputy chief role at Houston PD the previous year, and she was processing that with the particular controlled frustration she brought to most disappointments, which meant she wasn't talking about it, but was running 6 miles every morning instead of 4. I found the posting on a Tuesday night, slid my laptop across the dinner table, and said, "You'd be good at this." She looked at it for 30 seconds, then she closed the laptop and went to bed. 2 weeks later, she sent in her application without telling me until after she'd hit submit. She got the job in August 2022, Cypress Ridge's first female chief of police and the first black woman to hold the position in the department's 63-year history. The city council vote was unanimous. The announcement made the Houston Chronicle and got picked up by the Associated Press. Diana gave a press conference in front of the Cypress Ridge City Hall that I watched from the 3rd row with our son Marcus Jr. and our daughter Alicia, both of them home from college for the occasion, and I'm not ashamed to say I had to look at the ceiling for a moment to hold myself together. The 2023 Rolls-Royce Ghost extended in Midnight Sapphire was my idea and my gift. I know how that sounds. I know what people think when they hear that, but let me explain what that car actually was. Diana had spent 26 years driving department vehicles, her own beat-up Honda Accord on days off and various rentals on family vacations. She'd never owned anything that cost more than $38,000. She'd worked rotating shifts, missed holidays, sat through union negotiations and shooting reviews and community meetings and budget hearings and funerals for colleagues. She'd been sworn at, threatened, second-guessed, and underestimated her entire career. The Ghost cost $412,000 fully optioned, and I paid for it with money I'd saved over 28 years of working on industrial platforms in 100-degree Texas heat, and it was worth every cent of it. That car wasn't a status symbol. It was a receipt. We closed on the house at 48112 Cypress Ridge Estates Boulevard on September 15, 2022. 4 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, a 3-car garage on a 4-acre lot. The neighborhood had 340 homes built between 2008 and 2014, most valued between $650,000 and just over $1 million. Mature oak trees lining the streets, a community pool and clubhouse, a residents-only park. The HOA fee was $485 per month. The The CCRs were 47 pages long, and I read all of them before we signed anything. The rolls went in the garage every night. That's important. Every single night. That car was in the garage. Diana's official Cypress Ridge PD vehicle, a 2022 Chevrolet Tahoe in department black and white, stayed in the driveway. The ghost only came out for special occasions, weekends, and the occasional evening when Diana wanted to decompress on a long drive through the hill country. The day we moved in, I documented the garage configuration, the driveway layout, and the street parking situation with photographs, because 28 years of engineering had made documentation as automatic to me as breathing. Sentinel Guard Services had the security contract for Cypress Ridge Estates. They ran 2 patrol vehicles through the neighborhood on a rotating schedule, checking for violations, monitoring gates, responding to resident calls. The lead officer assigned to our section of the development was a man named Derek Poole. 44 years old, heavy-set, with a brown crew cut going gray at the temples and the particular bearing of someone who'd once had genuine law enforcement authority and was still adjusting to no longer having it. I learned later that Poole had been a deputy with the Harris County Sheriff's Office for 11 years before being separated from the department in 2019, under circumstances that his personnel file described as a mutual agreement following an internal affairs review. Sentinel had hired him 8 months after his departure from HCSO. Poole first made himself known to us on the morning of October 3, 2022, 18 days after we moved in. Diana had taken the ghost out that Saturday morning for a grocery run, parked in our driveway when she returned, and gone inside to put things away. She was inside for maybe 25 minutes. When I went out to help bring in the last bags, Poole's black Ford F-150 Security Edition was parked at the curb, and he was standing at the edge of our driveway, hands on his belt, looking at the car. "Morning," I said. He looked at me, then at the car, then back at me.
That vehicle registered to this address?
I set down the grocery bags I was carrying. "It is. Need to verify that. We've had reports of unfamiliar vehicles in the development. Reports from who? Residents. Part of our job is following up." I told him the car was registered to Diana Webb at our address and that he was welcome to verify that through normal channels. He wrote something in a small notebook, asked for my name, I gave it. He drove away without another word. I mentioned it to Diana that evening. She listened without expression, which is her way of processing something she considers significant. "Write it down," she said. "Time, date, what he said, what you said. I already had." The second incident was October 19th. Diana had parked the ghost in the driveway while the garage was temporarily occupied by a refrigerator we were waiting to have delivered to its final position. Poole knocked on our front door at 7:15 in the evening. When I answered, he asked whether the vehicle in the driveway was going to be there overnight, citing a CC&R provision about extended street and driveway parking affecting neighborhood aesthetics. I pointed out that the provision referenced vehicles parked on the street, not in a private driveway, and that our driveway was our property. He looked at the car again with an expression I'd seen before on job sites, on foremen who'd been told their interpretation of a safety regulation was wrong and didn't like it. He said he'd note it in his log and left. I pulled up the CCRs that night and read Section 6, 4 through 6, 9, which covered vehicle parking and storage. Driveway parking was explicitly permitted for personal vehicles. There was no provision limiting the duration or frequency of driveway use. I printed the relevant pages, highlighted the applicable sections, and added them to a folder I'd labeled Sentinel Interactions. The third incident was November 7th. Poole approached Diana directly as she was getting into the ghost in our driveway at 9 in the morning. I was in the garage and heard the conversation through the open door. He asked her to confirm her residency, citing a new visitor verification protocol the HOA had supposedly implemented. Diana, still 6 weeks from her official start date as chief, responded with the quiet precision of someone who has spent 26 years dealing with people who use procedural language to justify unjustifiable behavior. She told him her name, her address, and that she was a resident. She told him she did not consent to further questioning without cause. She came inside and said to me 3 times. "I know," I said. "He's never stopped anyone else on this street."
"I've been watching," I said. "You're right."
That was the thing I'd noticed by the third interaction. In the 43 days since we'd moved in, I'd observed Poole's patrol patterns from various windows and from the garage at different hours. I'd seen him stop to speak with exactly 0 other residents on our block. I'd seen him drive past 2 legitimately questionable parking situations, one involving a commercial contractor's van parked partially blocking a sidewalk for 3 days without stopping. But our driveway, with its midnight sapphire ghost, had warranted 3 separate personal approaches in 6 weeks. I added all of this to the folder. I also, on the evening of November 7th, adjusted the angles on 2 of our 3 exterior cameras to ensure full coverage of the driveway from multiple perspectives. The official swearing-in ceremony for Diana as Chief of Police was scheduled for Tuesday, December 6, 2022, at 10 in the morning at Cypress Ridge City Hall. The actual appointment had been made in August, but between onboarding, transition protocols, and the outgoing chief's retirement timeline, the formal public ceremony had been pushed to December. Diana had taken the oath privately in October for administrative purposes, which meant technically she'd been chief since October 14th, but December 6th was the public moment. The mayor would be there. The city council, Houston media. Members of the Houston PD command staff who'd been Diana's colleagues and supervisors for 2.5 decades. Our kids were flying in. Diana's mother, 73 years old and still sharp as a tack, was driving up from Beaumont. I set 2 alarms for 5:30 that morning because I didn't trust myself not to sleep through one of them. Diana was already up when I got downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table in her robe with a cup of tea, reviewing notes on a legal pad. The dress uniform was hung on the bedroom door, and I'd already confirmed it 3 times. The jacket, the slacks, the white dress shirt, the tie, the hat, the gloves, all in order, her badge in its velvet box. The commendations we'd spent 2 evenings organizing and pinning to the precise specifications of department protocol, everything exactly right. I took my coffee and went out the front door at 5:47 to get the newspaper, which I still got in print because some habits from my father are worth keeping. The boot was bright yellow, industrial grade, the kind with a dual arm design that locks around the wheel rim and cannot be removed without the key or a cutting tool. It was on the front left wheel of the Ghost, clamped tight with a bright orange Sentinel Guard Services notice zip-tied to the door handle. The notice said the vehicle had been immobilized for a parking violation per HOA Regulation 6-7C, and that removal required contacting Sentinel's dispatch line and paying a $385 administrative fee. I stood there for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. The Texas December air was 58 degrees, which in Houston passes for cold. The street was quiet. A mockingbird was going through its repertoire in the oak tree at the edge of our property. I looked at the boot. I looked at the notice. I looked at the car, which was in our driveway, exactly where it was permitted to be, exactly where it had been every other time Poole had found it convenient to stop and question us about it. Then I went back inside and got my phone. I did not wake Diana, not yet. She had 3 hours before the most important morning of her professional life, and I was not going to put this in front of her until I understood exactly what it was. I went to the garage, pulled up the camera app on my phone, and started reviewing footage. The Arlo Ultra 4K on the garage corner had full coverage of the driveway from a 40-degree angle. The Ring Pro above the front door covered the front approach. The third camera, a Wise Cam I'd mounted on the fence at the east side of the property line 3 weeks earlier, after the November 7th interaction, had a lateral view that caught the street in front of the house. I pulled all 3 feeds simultaneously on my laptop at the workbench and started at midnight at 2:31 in the morning. Derek Poole's black Ford F-150 appeared on the Wise Cam feed, moving slowly down Cypress Ridge Estates Boulevard. It stopped in front of our house. The Arlo camera picked him up as he got out of the truck, walked up the driveway with the boot device, and clamped it to the Ghost's front left wheel in a process that took about 4 minutes. He attached the orange notice to the door handle, took 2 photographs with his phone, got back in his truck, and drove away. The timestamp on the Arlo footage read 2:34 to 2:38 a.m. I watched it twice, Then I pulled up the camera logs for the previous 6 weeks and did something methodical and deliberate. I went through every recorded instance of Poole's patrol passing our street, cross-referenced it with any other vehicle interactions I could find in the footage, and built a comparison. In 43 nights of patrol coverage captured on my cameras, Poole had stopped at or near our property 14 times. In the same period, his patrol had passed a white BMW 7 Series belonging to a neighbor, 3 houses down, that was parked partially on the grass on 2 separate occasions, a violation actually listed in the CCNRs, without stopping. He'd passed a boat trailer parked in a driveway for 11 consecutive days, which was explicitly prohibited under Section 6(9), without stopping. He'd driven past a pickup truck with an expired registration sticker visible from the street without stopping. Our car, legally parked in our own driveway, had been booted at 2:34 in the morning on the day of my wife's swearing-in ceremony. I was still at the workbench when Diana appeared in the garage doorway at 6:15, already dressed in her workout clothes, looking for her running shoes, which she kept on a rack near the door. She saw my expression before she saw anything else.
"What happened?" she said.
I turned the laptop to face her. She looked at the screen, looked at the Arlo footage I'd paused on the frame where Poole was clamping the boot. She was quiet for a long moment. I watched her go through the same process I'd gone through an hour earlier: the assessment, the calculation, the controlled decision about what to feel and when to feel it. It was the same thing I'd seen her do at the kitchen table when she got the news about being passed over for deputy chief. The same thing I'd seen her do at memorial services for fallen officers. Diana didn't suppress emotion. She filed it somewhere organized and accessed it on her own schedule. "The ceremony is in 3 hours and 45 minutes, she said. "I know." She looked at the car through the garage window for a moment. "Call a locksmith, someone who can cut it without damaging the wheel. I need to be in that car by 9:15. Already have one on the way. He'll be here by 7:30. She almost smiled. Then she went back inside to make breakfast, because Diana Webb does not let chaos disrupt a meal. I heard her in the kitchen, moving deliberately, the sound of the refrigerator, the burners, the routine of a woman who has managed crisis for 26 years and knows that breakfast is not optional. I called Marcus Jr. at 6:30 and told him what had happened, and to not say anything to his grandmother when she arrived. Then I called Harold Drummond. Harold was 69 years old and lived 4 houses down at 4776, a retired Harris County sheriff who'd served 31 years, the last 8 as undersheriff. He'd introduced himself the day we moved in with a handshake and a bottle of Maker's Mark and the unprompted information that he'd known 3 Cypress Ridge chiefs over the years and that the department had needed new leadership for some time. He'd become my primary neighborhood context in the weeks since, the kind of neighbor whose value is not in what he does, but in what he knows. He answered on the second ring. I told him about the boot. There was a short silence. "Poole did it," he said, "on camera, 2:30 in the morning." Another silence. "Marcus, I want you to listen to me carefully. That man was separated from Harris County SO in 2019, following a complaint pattern that involved a very specific kind of selective enforcement. I can't give you the details because some of it is still in personnel records, but I can tell you that what you're describing is consistent with what I know about him." He paused. "How much of this do you have documented?" 6 weeks of footage, 14 interactions, a comparison log of how other vehicles were treated, the boot on camera, the notice, the CCNR text showing the parking was legal. Harold was quiet for another beat. "You need to call Simone Carter. She's a civil rights and real estate attorney in Houston, Greenway Plaza. Tell her I sent you. Call her at 7. I called Simone Carter at 7:02. She answered because Harold had already texted her. She listened to my summary, without interrupting, asked 4 precise questions about what I had documented, and said, "Can you be in my office at 2 this afternoon with everything?" I told her Diana had her swearing-in ceremony at 10, but we could be there by 2. She said, "I'll clear my afternoon." The locksmith arrived at 7:28. His name was Eddie. He was maybe 30, and he had the boot off in 11 minutes using a hydraulic spreader that left no mark on the wheel. He charged $275 for the emergency call, which I paid in cash and logged immediately in the folder. I photographed the boot lying on the driveway before he took it, photographed the wheel after removal, photographed the orange sentinel notice from 3 angles. Diana came out of the house at 7:50 in her dress uniform, and I stopped what I was doing because she was magnificent. 30 years I have known that woman, and I have never been more certain of anything than I was in that moment, standing in our driveway in Cypress Ridge Estates, watching Diana Webb in full chief's dress uniform walk toward her midnight sapphire Rolls-Royce Ghost on the morning of her official swearing-in. Whatever Poole had intended with that boot, whatever Ashby had enabled or encouraged, whatever petty calculation had been made at 2:30 in the morning in the dark of our driveway, this was the answer to it. Not revenge, not anger, just the undeniable fact of who she was. She looked at the car, looked at the driveway, looked at me. "Thank you," she said. "All good," I said. She drove. I followed in my truck. The ceremony was everything it was supposed to be. The mayor gave a speech. The outgoing chief said gracious things. Diana's mother cried, which made Alicia cry, which made Marcus Jr. pretend to look at something on his phone while his eyes went bright. Diana delivered remarks that were 11 minutes long, precise and warm and honest, the way she does everything. She talked about what the city deserved from its police department and what she intended to provide. She talked about the officers she'd be leading and her respect for their work. She did not mention the boot, the 2:30 a.m. patrol, or the yellow clamp sitting in the back of my truck. That morning belonged to something bigger than Derek Poole, and she knew it. We were in Simone Carter's office on the 14th floor of a Greenway Plaza tower at 2:08 that afternoon, Diana still in her dress uniform because there hadn't been time to change. Simone was 39, natural hair pulled back, wearing a gray blazer over a blue dress, the kind of attorney whose office tells you everything about her without a single word being spoken. Shelves of organized case files, 2 whiteboards with color-coded timelines, a view of the 6-1 DIN loop, stretching toward downtown Houston. She shook Diana's hand and said simply, "Chief Webb, congratulations on the appointment. I'm sorry, this is the context in which we're meeting." I laid the folder on her conference table, all 6 weeks of documentation. The camera footage on a USB drive, the comparison log I'd built that morning of Poole's selective enforcement pattern, the CC&R sections, the boot photographs, the locksmith receipt, the sentinel notice, the timeline. Simone went through it, methodically asking questions as she read. After about 20 minutes, she sat back and looked at both of us. "Let me tell you what I see here," she said. "First, the boot itself is legally problematic. Texas Transportation Code, Section 684, governs vehicle immobilization, and it requires specific conditions that don't appear to have been met. The vehicle was in a private driveway, not on a public street or common area. The CC&R provision Sentinel cited, Section 6(7)(c), applies specifically to common area parking, not private driveways. The boot was applied without proper notice and outside the parameters of both the HOA's own rules and state law. That's unlawful immobilization." She tapped the comparison log. "Second, what your husband has documented here is a pattern of selective enforcement. 14 contacts with your vehicle over 6 weeks, 0 comparable contacts with vehicles that were actually in violation. That pattern, combined with the documented absence of action on genuine violations, supports a disparate treatment claim under the Texas Fair Housing Act and potentially Federal Fair Housing Act provisions. The question of discriminatory motive is supported by the pattern itself." She paused and looked at Diana directly. "Chief Webb, I understand you now oversee the Private Security Licensing Division for the city of Cypress Ridge. Is that accurate?" Diana nodded. "Sentinel Guard Services operates under a license issued by the city. My office has oversight of that licensing program." Simone let that sit for a moment. "I want to be thoughtful about how that authority is exercised in this situation, because there are ethical lines we need to respect between your personal claim and your official authority. But I also want you to understand that Sentinel's license is a relevant fact in the broader picture, and there are appropriate channels through which a licensing review can be initiated based on documented officer misconduct that are entirely separate from this civil matter." I pulled out the last item in the folder. "There's something else," I said. Patricia Nguyen had texted me at 11:30 that morning, during the ceremony reception, and asked if she could call me privately. Patricia was 47, a software executive who'd been on the HOA board for 3 years. I'd spoken to her twice at neighborhood events and found her thoughtful and uncomfortable in her role in ways she hadn't quite articulated. She called me at 1:15 while Diana and I were driving to Simone's office, and she spoke quickly, like someone who'd been rehearsing and wanted to get it out before she changed her mind. She told me that on November 8th, the day after Poole's third approach to Diana in the driveway, Ronald Ashby had sent an email to the 4 other board members. She read it to me over the phone, and I typed it into a notes app as she spoke, asking her to slow down twice to make sure I had it exactly right. The email described what Ashby called a pattern of concern regarding a recent move-in and the type of vehicle being used by residents at 48112. The email referenced property value perceptions and the importance of the community maintaining its standards. It said Poole had been made aware and was monitoring the situation. It did not use explicit language. It didn't need to. Patricia said she'd been troubled by it since November and that what had happened this morning had made her unable to stay quiet. I printed it from my notes app on Simone's office printer and slid it across the conference table. Simone read it twice. When she looked up, something in her professional composure had shifted slightly. Not anger. Something colder and more precise. "Mr. Webb," she said, "when did you say you retired from engineering? 2 years ago? And you documented all of this over 6 weeks on your own initiative, before any legal involvement, simply because documentation is a reflex?" "That's right." She looked at the email again. "This," she said, "combined with the pattern documentation, constitutes evidence of discriminatory intent, not just disparate treatment intent." She set it down. "This changes the scope of what we're looking at considerably." She outlined the legal strategy that afternoon on the whiteboard while Diana and I sat across from her. 3 tracks, similar to what Marcus the attorney had done for Dan Kowalski up in Ohio, though I didn't know that story at the time. Civil claims against Sentinel Guard Services and the HOA under the Texas Fair Housing Act and federal civil rights provisions, an unlawful immobilization claim under Texas Transportation Code 684, with treble damages available under the statute, and a formal complaint to the Texas Department of Public Safety's Private Security Regulatory Division, which has authority over Sentinel's statewide licensing, completely separate from Diana's city licensing authority. "What do we want?" Simone asked, the same question Sandra had asked Marcus Webb's attorney in Ohio. Diana answered before I could. She'd been mostly quiet through the meeting, watching, processing, doing that filing thing she does with emotion. "I want 3 things," she said. "I want a documented acknowledgement that what happened was wrong and why. I want structural changes to how Sentinel operates in this neighborhood and how the HOA oversees them. And I want to make sure Derek Poole cannot do this to anyone else in a position of private security authority." She paused. "I am not interested in destroying anyone. I am interested in consequences that mean something." Simone nodded slowly. "Those are the right terms. Let's build toward them." The first formal move was Simone's demand letter to the HOA and to Sentinel Guard Services, delivered on December 9th, 3 days after the ceremony. The letter laid out the documented timeline, cited the specific legal provisions, attached the comparison log, referenced the Ashby email as Exhibit A, and stated clearly that my family was prepared to pursue all available legal remedies unless good faith negotiations commenced within 10 business days. The letter was 14 pages. Simone had written it in 2 days, which told me something about how clear-cut the situation was in her professional assessment. I heard through Harold Drummond that Ashby had called an emergency board meeting on December 11th. Harold had a source on the board who wasn't Patricia and who preferred to remain nameless, but who had apparently described the meeting as one of the more uncomfortable 2 hours in recent HOA memory. Ashby had tried to frame the demand letter as an overreach, an attempt by a new resident to leverage legal threats for preferential treatment. Patricia Nguyen had reportedly asked him, directly and in front of the full board, whether he wanted to explain his November 8th email in that same frame. The meeting had ended without resolution, but with a noticeable fracture in board cohesion. On December 15th, the Texas Department of Public Safety opened a regulatory review of Sentinel Guard services based on a complaint that was, procedurally, filed through proper channels by a private citizen and had nothing to do with Diana's official authority. The complaint cited the documentation I'd compiled, the pattern of selective enforcement, and the unlawful immobilization. Harold had helped me understand the correct filing process and the specific regulatory provisions that applied. He'd spent an evening at our kitchen table going through the Texas Occupations Code, Chapter 1702 with me, pointing to the sections governing conduct standards for licensed security personnel and the provisions allowing license suspension or revocation for documented misconduct. Sentinel's Harris County regional license was worth approximately $2.3 million in annual contract revenue, including the Cypress Ridge Estates contract and 7 other residential and commercial accounts. The DPS review, once opened, required Sentinel to respond to the documented complaint within 30 days or face automatic suspension proceedings. I learned this from Simone, who had a contact at DPS, who confirmed the review was being treated as a priority matter given the volume and quality of the documentation submitted. Derek Poole was placed on administrative leave by Sentinel on December 18th. The company's regional director, a man named Charles Whitfield, called Simone's office to open settlement discussions the same day. Simone called me to relay this and said, with characteristic understatement, they appear to have done their math. Ronald Ashby resigned from the HOA presidency on December 22nd. Patricia Nguyen told me about it by text. It's done. Board accepted resignation, effective immediately. Emergency election scheduled for January. Then she added, I'm sorry it took this long for anyone to say something. I thought about that for a while. The thing about systems is that they tend to continue until someone applies sufficient counterforce. Ashby's email, Poole's 14 approaches, the 2:30 a.m. boot. All of it had been happening in a context where the assumption was that no one would push back with sufficient force or knowledge to make pushing back matter. What they hadn't accounted for was that they'd done it to an engineer who documents everything by reflex and a police chief who'd spent 26 years understanding how misconduct gets proven and prosecuted. The settlement negotiations lasted 3 weeks. Simone ran them with the focused efficiency of someone who knew she was holding the stronger hand and didn't need to press any harder than necessary. The final agreement, signed on January 14, 2023, included the following terms. Sentinel Guard Services paid $67,000 in direct settlement to Diana and me, covering unlawful immobilization damages under Texas Transportation Code treble damage provisions. The $275 locksmith fee documented legal costs and compensatory damages for the emotional distress of having a boot placed on the car of a newly sworn police chief on her ceremony morning. Sentinel also terminated Derek Poole's employment and agreed to a binding protocol requiring all immobilization actions on private driveways to receive written HOA board approval and attorney review before application, a procedure that effectively made improper boots nearly impossible under their operational structure. The HOA entered a separate settlement of $18,000 covering the discriminatory enforcement claim, agreed to a mandatory fair housing training requirement for all board members within 90 days, and committed to an independent review of their vendor oversight procedures for security contractors. The Ashby email was acknowledged in the settlement agreement as inconsistent with the HOA's legal obligations under the Texas Fair Housing Act. That acknowledgement was, for me, the most important single line in the entire document. The DPS regulatory review concluded in February 2023 with a formal finding of conduct violations against Sentinel's operating license. The license was placed on 18 months probation with quarterly audits. Charles Whitfield, Sentinel's regional director, sent Simone a letter that she shared with me in which he described the situation as a significant learning experience for his organization. I didn't find that phrase satisfying exactly, but I understood what it meant in practical terms. 18 months of quarterly audits and probationary status is not a learning experience anyone at Sentinel would choose to repeat. Diana and I attended the HOA's emergency board election in late January 2023. Patricia Nguyen ran for president and won by a comfortable margin. The new board held its first meeting in February, and one of the first agenda items was a complete review of the Sentinel Guard Services contract, which was ultimately allowed to expire at its March 31st renewal date. The neighborhood hired a different security company, one with a clean regulatory record, a written non-discrimination policy in its operating procedures, and a specific protocol for resident interactions that required documentation and supervisory review for any repeat contact with the same resident within a 30-day period. I'm sitting on our back porch writing this on an October evening, 9 months after that December morning. The air is finally starting to ease out of the Houston summer into something breathable, that brief window between the end of real heat and the start of what passes for Houston winter. Diana is inside on a phone call, the kind that goes late when you're running a police department, her voice carrying faintly through the screen door. The ghost is in the garage, clean, covered exactly where it belongs. I think about that morning sometimes, the specific quality of the stillness at 5:47 a.m. with the mockingbird going in the oak tree and that yellow boot on my wife's wheel. I think about what Poole thought he was doing and what Ashby thought he was enabling, and the particular confidence required to take that action in the dark in someone's private driveway without knowing anything about who they actually were. There's a word for that kind of confidence, the kind that comes from years of small power going unchecked, and the word isn't courage. It's assumption. The assumption that the calculation has already been made and it came out in your favor. The assumption that certain cars in certain driveways represent a vulnerability, not a permanence. What they didn't know about Diana Webb, what they couldn't have known because they hadn't bothered to find out, was that she'd spent 26 years watching assumption get prosecuted. She'd seen it in interrogation rooms and courtrooms and internal affairs proceedings and community meetings. She knew exactly what it looked like when someone's unchecked assumption met a fully documented record of its own behavior. She knew what happened next. Harold came over for dinner last week. Sat on this same porch with a glass of Maker's Mark, the way he does when the evenings cool down enough to be outside. We talked about the neighborhood for a while, how things had settled, how the new security company was working out, how Patricia was doing with the board. Then Harold said, in that way he has of arriving at the point without appearing to approach it, "You know what the real story was, don't you?" "Tell me," I said. "The real story wasn't the boot. The real story was that they'd done versions of this before. Different cars, different streets, different situations, and nobody had the combination of time, tools, and disposition to document it properly." He swirled his glass. "Most people don't keep folders. I thought about that. 28 years of engineering had taught me that every system failure leaves evidence. The failure itself is always somewhere in the record. The question is only whether anyone cares enough to look and knows how to read what they find. Poole's mistake wasn't putting the boot on Diana Webb's car. His mistake was doing it in front of 3 cameras owned by a retired mechanical engineer who considers a manila folder an emotional support object. There's a thing Diana said to me 2 weeks after the settlement on a Sunday morning when we were driving back from church that I keep returning to. She was looking out the passenger window at the highway, and she said, without particular emphasis, 26 years I spent working within a system that didn't always work the way it was supposed to, and the thing I learned is that the system usually gets there eventually if you stay inside it and keep your documentation." She paused and watched an exit go by. The people who count on other people giving up are always surprised when they don't. That Rolls-Royce Ghost is still the most beautiful car I've ever bought. Midnight sapphire in October sunlight is a color that doesn't photograph correctly. You have to see it in person to understand what I mean. Diana drives it maybe twice a month, the same way she always has, the same way she'll keep having it, because she earned it the same way she earned everything else in her life. With 26 years of work and documentation and refusing to give up. If you've ever had someone with just enough authority make assumptions about what you were allowed to have or where you were allowed to be, I'd genuinely like to hear about it. What happened? And what did you do? Leave it in the comments.
I read every one.